Hello, and welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. On today's podcast, in 1948, 192 countries agreed to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which deemed housing as a human right. But today, the world is faced with a global housing crisis. Can this crisis be resolved? Today, I'll be speaking with Matthew Dunbar, Chief Strategy Officer and Executive Vice President for Habitat for Humanity of New York and Westchester County, and Dr. Maria Carrizosa, Associate Director for Global Policy Housing for Habitat for Humanity International. And she is also the author of a new book, Homes at Work, Urban Informality and Recognition in Latin America and Africa. I want to thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. What a pleasure.
Matt and Maria and Dr. Carrizosa, both of you have done extensive traveling in your work. But let me ask you this. Given everything that's going on, given the fact that housing has been deemed a housing right for decades now, and when you see the fact that up to 1 billion people have lack of housing or inadequate housing, how did we get to this point? And Matt, let me start with you on that.
Sure. I would say that, getting to this point includes the fact that not a lot of places have necessarily incorporated the housing as a human right into their actual policies and procedures. In many places across the country, and we work, with my affiliate in the New York City and Westchester area, there are a lot of places that haven't, included a right to housing in their structures. There's a lot of places that haven't created housing agencies and implemented policies that would actually realize and actualize those, that sentiment or that actual human right into how they fund their governments, how they implement their policies. And in New York City, we actually incorporated the right to shelter into the city charter. It's not necessarily a right to housing, but it is a right to shelter that has been created within the city charter that requires the city to provide shelter opportunities for its residents. But even with that, even recently, because of our challenges around homelessness crisis, as well as increase in asylum seekers, the mayor, even here in New York City, which has strived to meet those goals, has actually suspended even the right to shelter temporarily in New York City. So I'd say that those are some of the structural barriers, both will, finances, and policy that would actually implement and realize that human right locally and domestically.
Dr. Carrizosa, how would you respond to that on a global sense in terms of how we got to this situation?
It is such a loaded question, Tony. I think first, it's not only the right to housing, and the right to adequate housing includes at least 7 sort of dimensions. One, that housing has to be affordable. Another one, that it has to be well located. Another one, that it has to have services, water, facilities, energy. Another one, that it has to be habitable, that the structure has to be strong enough. Another one, that there has to be a security of tenure. You have to be not at risk of being evicted. On top of that, there is the need for adequate housing to be culturally adequate and accessible to people with limited mobilities or different necessities, and increasingly so sustainable. So getting housing right, it's very, very tough. That is why Matt was raising the distinction between shelter and adequate housing. And governments are rightly so fear of adopting and embracing the right of housing because it's difficult. There's land scarcity. There is governments do not have all the power they wish they had to deliver. There are many reasons, but I'm gonna try to keep it short for.
No, that's fine. Let me ask both of you. One of the things that have come up is the notion of the financialization of housing.
Yeah.
How does that contribute to the problem as well?
Well, it's a huge problem domestically, and I think internationally. On the domestic side, scarcity of housing and just the simple economics of supply and demand has really increased the cost for both rental and home ownership. And then additionally, the cost of construction, has then increased the challenges that we face, and land scarcity, as Maria mentioned, is huge. And so we see in New York City that we've seen a 30% increase in rental costs, rental prices and rents, 50% increase in home ownership. That's even more outside of the city area, where it gets to 40 to 60% increase in costs. And that is because we've seen a dramatic increase in job opportunities and influx of population, but our supply hasn't kept up with that demand. And so, recently the governor has put forward policy proposals that would seek to increase the number of housing units in our metro area to 800 more, increase it by 800,000 units. Which is what the deficit is. And that deficit has really led to a lot of that increased cost. And so it's really, a scenario in which both the affordability and the access to affordable housing and policies that would keep rents and costs low isn't there. And the market and the commodification of housing has really incentivized, with that scarcity, the increase in prices to actual residents and potential home buyers, which has created, really a perfect storm of increased costs that are contributing to our homelessness crisis and our unaffordability crisis.
Dr. Carrizosa, would it be the same globally in terms of the financialization of housing, which seems to have started, at least in the United States, probably late 70s, early 80s, when it really took off? Would that be a reason as well for the problem that we see globally?
I would say that yes, the financialization of housing is a global phenomenon, accentuated also after the crisis of the 208, 2008, sorry. And it's basically the idea. I want to go back to what is it, because it is basically the idea that housing is not understood as a thing that can give a family peacefulness, shelter, sense of security, well-being. The house as part of the health infrastructure, as we saw with the COVID pandemic. House as part of the work infrastructure, as we see informal workers around the world using their house to work, or even ourselves working today from home. But it is understood as a commodity, and not only as a commodity, as Matt has mentioned before, but really a financial asset. It has divorced itself from the physical thing, the house, and it has become an asset that is traded in the financial market. And then there's a lot of appetite to construct and to build in unsustainable ways. And that sort of construction growth is not necessarily paired with the real demand in the ground. Housing prices go up because they're fueled by this financialization, and the people are still in need of housing. This creates houses without people, just as financial assets, and people without housing in need of affordable housing.
So, in
and
part,
I would say it's a global phenomenon, yeah.
And to piggyback off of that, you're looking at a paradigm shift, really. And because in your book, and one of your quotes from your book, and when you say, and it's in the context of the pandemic, and you say this public health mandate strikingly reveals the obvious, that homes are a crucial component of the public health infrastructure. So you're looking to change the paradigm by which we look at homes, whereas the commodification of them seeks, it's really a place to park capital, but not a place where we look to build communities and stability. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for bringing up my work. And my research is basically on informal settlements, but I think it applies across different types of houses, also in the global north as in the global south. Houses become part of our health infrastructure, as I was mentioning. We need a place to live in order to keep ourselves and our families safe and healthy. We need the house to be able to send our children to school. We need our house to have a well-being in general. In fact, I want to bring about not my work, but you Habitat for Humanity's latest research and sort of that is inspiring a new 5-year campaign called Home Equals, and this campaign and the research behind this campaign puts forth the idea that housing, if invested upon, could have enormous impacts on life expectancy across the world, as much as a 4% increase in life expectancy across the world if we really invest in housing and informal settlements. Or GDP even. GDP could rise as much as 10% if we get the housing infrastructure right. Or years of schooling, as much as 40 million kids could remain in school if we get housing right. So housing is basically, yes, a basic infrastructure for well-being in general, and not just a shelter, not just 4 walls and a roof over people's heads.
And speaking about the Home Equals campaign, this is something that you also had sent over to the G7 meeting that they recently had in Hiroshima. And the White House did issue a communique, and it talked about infrastructure, it talked about that. But has there been a response from the G7 in regards to this campaign, which is a major campaign, not just Habitat for Humanity, but a lot of global partners? Has there been a response from them?
So we just launched Habitat for Humanity International, just launched this campaign less than 20 days ago. So we are really ambitious on our plan to push forth G7 countries to embrace this, to adopt it, to take seriously housing and informal settlements in a bigger way, in a way that it has not happened before. But our presence this year in the G7 was not so much expecting to get the results, because we've just launched, but to learn the ways of engaging with this landscape and plan for a very serious, ambitious plan for the G7 over the next 5 years. So we are newcomers into this ground, and we are planning on stepping really hard. But this time around was not the big shout.
Matthew, let me follow up with you. Throughout your career, you've had experience in terms of building coalitions, understanding the nature of the politics of housing. So how does that work for you? And understanding that there really are perhaps two sets of interests. There is the real estate that wants to make a profit, and then there's the advocacy, which you represent, which is to implement policies that make housing available for people. So how does your organizing affect this work, and can it lead to greater things happening not only in New York, but across the nation, and perhaps serve as a model for the world, in keeping with what Dr. Carrizosa just said about Home Equals campaign?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. I think there often is a tension between sometimes between the profit motivation, around housing and, the use value, right? Investment value versus use value. And, Habitat, is one of those organizations that can bring various sides of our sectors and our society together for a common goal, because I think bottom line is that we all agree that housing is incredibly essential to the well-being of our societies and our communities. And so identifying ways that we can, incentivize policies that allow for the increased construction and preservation of existing affordable housing, as well as providing those opportunities for organizations and businesses to be able to access some of those resources in order to, to make it profitable in order to advance these things. The tension lies in which when those things are at odds. So where, there have been, especially since the Great Recession, an increase in investor purchases, for example, around what would have otherwise been first-time home ownership opportunities for first-time home buyers have now, at the lower cost end of the home ownership market, have many of those have been purchased for investment purposes. And so in those circumstances, there is a real need for us to potentially push back against a lot of the systems that incentivize that kind of commodification of housing that really does siphon off homes for people to be able to live in, to thrive in, and to build equity in. And so our organizing has really been focused on bringing people together from the faith community, from our corporate partners, from various sectors, which include, volunteers, it includes donors, individual people through our various kind of networks of support, our Habitat Young Professionals, our Women Build volunteers, and really kind of educating folks around the policy issues that would allow for the creation and preservation of housing, and change the systems to better balance the use value and the potential investment value, and create opportunities for actual people to see some of the realization of equity through the increased value of property, but also be able to get access to future generations. So we've been advocates for the community land trust model, for access to rent stabilization laws that keep rents from exorbitant increases, and that will allow for our society to better balance both the use value and investment value of housing.
And staying with that for a minute, I was reading somewhere, and I was kind of surprised to read this, that in many parts of the country, it is actually illegal to build affordable housing because of the exclusionary zoning laws. But also, we have to remember that during the Clinton years, Clinton signed into law to end the Faircloth Amendment, which essentially ended the additional construction of public housing. That has been overturned in the House, but it still is stagnant in terms of the Senate. So how do you begin to address issues like that, where the exclusionary zoning laws make it illegal to consider affordable housing in just about 90 to 95% of the country?
No, it's a great question, and the exclusionary housing, kind of policies that came into place, heavily around World War II and through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was a lot of policies that essentially made, especially multifamily housing, illegal. So a lot of the exclusionary zoning kind of downzoned communities that you can only build single-family homes. There's policies that require, even 3 to 4 car garages, large lot sizes, which all increases the cost to create that housing, and then of course then to purchase that housing or rent it. And also there's a lot of policies around local control, and that's really one of the areas that we've found to be a challenge in our region, especially in the suburbs outside of New York City, where communities have put into place systems and structures that allow them to continue to say no. Even when, developers have really, modest approaches where you want to build housing, multifamily housing along transit corridors, where we've invested in the infrastructure to create that housing. A lot of communities are opposed to it. So you see a lot of not in my backyard NIMBYism that prevents that, and they hold tight to their local control and to the exclusionary zoning and say we want to preserve the character of our communities, which have historically been built off of racist and segregationist housing policies. And so we have seen more of a movement, especially more recently over the past 5 to 10 years of a yes in my backyard movement to push back on those policies. And we've seen, places like California and Massachusetts and Connecticut put into place policies that would eradicate single family zones and allow people to build 2 to 4 family homes in those communities to create accessory dwelling units, which is very modest density, adding a small rental unit to a single family home. There are those types of policies that have been advanced. We still see a lot of pushback in our region, in New York City and metro area and in New York. And so we are part of coalitions and are trying to expand and build those coalitions to help provide a movement so that we can, continue to eradicate that exclusionary zoning and create more housing in our community that would really help meet the demand that we have and balance the supply a little bit more.
Dr. Carrizosa, let me ask you this question in piggybacking on what Matthew just said. The World Economic Forum says that we need to build 96,000 units of housing per day for the next umpteen years, however long it's going to be, because of the projected population growth. Taking into consideration what Matthew just said, there are a lot of communities such as South Africa and others who also don't want certain kinds of housing in their backyard. So number one, can that goal of 96,000 homes per day be realized? And what will it take to actually realize it in a lot of these places? I mean, I know places like Singapore has been doing interesting things. Japan, I think, is doing something interesting. And even India is trying to do certain things. But how do you make this happen?
Great question. Thank you. I think there are different sort of facets to that question. One is that perhaps what happens if the government governments around the world are not able to provide that housing, or markets are not able to provide that amount of housing, like basically a house per second, which is very likely the case. People are still going to live somewhere, and people are going to solve their problems on their own terms. And informal settlements will continue to grow. Informal subdivisions of houses, ingrowth of our inner cities. So there needs to be a very aggressive policy front, not only on the home construction front, but on the home infill, rebuilding, densification, and upgrading of informal settlements. And to take a new home construction approach only is very wrong. It's incomplete and will not get the job done. There are cases as perverse as the Chile case. The Chilean government did their homework. They managed to curb completely their deficit of housing for the low-income population. They built all the houses they needed, but they built it so far and of such poor quality that families were not able to live there appropriately. So the government had to instantly, almost as soon as the projects finished, had to come in and then improve those housing projects, which makes no sense. Not only poor quality and poor location, but let's consider also the sustainability of those approaches. Like only a housing policy only focused on new houses in new pieces of land will not get the job done. It has to be multifaceted, and yeah, that's.
Do either of you, and this is to both of you, Portugal, for example, had protests for housing, and there are other nations that have seen protests for affordable housing. Do you see, if the crisis continues, that there will be probably more protests from people to say to the government, we need to have affordable housing? So the question, is really that people are not going to really stand for this for too much longer. I mean, if you can't get adequate housing, what do you see happening if this issue continues amongst the populations?
Yeah. I mean, we've started to see a lot more engagement and protests in our region, especially. And as of right now, at the beginning of June 2023, our legislature is about to end the session with not having passed the significant legislation that's needed to meet some of the need. And Maria talked about existing housing stock and making sure it's livable. We have tens of thousands of illegal basement apartments in New York City. And when Hurricane Ida came through, I think 13 people died, many of them drowned in their own basements. We are in desperate need of policies that will help to legalize and create safe living circumstances, and even developed places like New York City, where these illegal housing situations that have cropped up because of the housing need are really putting people in harm's way. And we actually have about 60,000 units being warehoused in New York City that are vacant, that could be rented, but because of various profit incentives are being held off the market to try to help incentivize opportunities for them to skyrocket those rents. And so, because of things like this, and because of the inaction of our governments and our policymakers in actually meeting the need and passing laws that will help to create tax incentives for the preservation of affordable housing in high cost markets, to help convert empty commercial spaces in Manhattan to be able to turn them into residential properties, which we still can't do, even though a lot of those spaces are vacant. The more that these things continue to drag on, and internationally, the more we see people at risk and not having affordable and safe places to live, the more people are going to be disgruntled and to also be justified in pushing back and organizing. And so we see more buildings organizing in New York City. We see more people doing marches across the bridge or occupying our legislative house. That is only going to grow, and it only should grow in order to put pressure on our policymakers to actually take this crisis in the serious nature that it deserves, and to pass policies that will actually put a dent in the affordability crisis and our continued increase in homelessness and unhoused people in our communities.
Dr. Carrizosa?
Yeah, I kept thinking as Matt was answering this so thoroughly and so well, that we keep saying and blaming the government for inaction, but there's some, and is the shift in housing policy where that happened around the 90s here and around the world pretty much, where governments started to take the back seat in housing policy. It started not being direct providers of housing, and taking the role of market facilitators or market enablers. And this has not been great. And I think there's a need for more direct provision from the government. There is also the need for continued engagement of the developers and the private sector, and there also needs to be like a third sort of wheel on this, a more coalition, grassroots-based community approach to housing provision, because they are actually doing a lot, and they could do even more with the right policies and the right environment. So the market, the government should not be only a market facilitator, but also a community facilitator.
In the few minutes we have left, let me ask you this. In America, from the American perspective, we have an election coming up in 2024, but nowhere in any of the stump speeches do you hear someone speak about housing. And in most countries, I would suggest that unless those countries where there is protest, do you hear any politician or government official really talk about housing? How do you get this issue off of the periphery of political speak and onto the main agenda? How does that happen? And Dr. Carrizosa, let me start with you.
Oh, no. I think housing is so complex and so spread out between sectors that it makes it even more relevant and more elusive to sort of grapple with. And you're correct in saying we need more housing, public discussions around housing. We need a higher sort of visibility of housing in global discussions, in national discussions. We need more earmarked funds in national budgets and in overseas development assistance funds specifically for housing. So we're not only talking about traditional sectors, but make it more visible, the housing finance as a rubric of discussion. Um, um, I could talk on and on, but I will let Matt complement.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and you're correct. Housing has not been on the forefront of the debates in past presidential cycles. There was a policy that was presented by the current administration called, I think it was Build Back Better, and that bill had a lot of amazing sector transformative policies in it. And it was stripped out of the infrastructure package that ended up passing. And so I think that it would be valuable and it would be politically beneficial for politicians to bring those policies back up and to be talking more about home, and also to talk about the aspect of home that we all experienced during the pandemic. The fact that the literal prescription when a pandemic hit was to stay home. And so when you had unstable housing situations, it became incredibly obvious that it was a public health issue. And I think that tying those things back together and reminding people about how important home is critically important. But I think it's also important for folks to realize that when people, like the majority of Americans are stably housed, we have a high rate of home ownership in this country, and it's disproportionate based on race and ethnicity. But there are perverse disincentives for people to actually sometimes care about increasing the supply of housing. They say they see their property values oftentimes, and the increase in supply potentially having a negative effect on their investment. So I think what we talked about earlier is critically important, to really humanize the topic and to help to organize and get people out to vote and organize elections around and with people that are unstably housed. I think that's a critical aspect of rising this issue in the public eye, is to really invest more in organizing voters that see housing insecurity in their daily lives, and to get them out to the polls to vote. So I think it's a real organizing and a communications issue as well.
And expanding on what you just said, in terms of how people think about housing and also a paradigm shift, I know the SHIFT initiative by Lalani Farha, who used to be with the United Nations, is trying to do that. But one of the questions is, I remember back, Dr. Carrizosa alluded to, in 2008, President Obama proposes some relief for homeowners in terms of their mortgage. Well, there's a certain segment of the population that went apoplectic on that. I remember watching Rick Santelli on CNBC, and his head almost spun around. And so there is this paradigm that housing as a right versus housing as an accomplishment. And so the question is, how do you get people to understand in Dr. Carrizosa's way, in terms of a book and understanding home as work, home as home working, and the like? How do you begin to do that? Because that seems to be a very broad conversation that needs to happen, but it's going to take a while. So with that, Dr. Carrizosa, how would you get that conversation started, let's say in the United States and globally?
Oh my goodness, what a question. I think, yeah, I'm stuck thinking that we have to acknowledge that housing is nonetheless very worthy as the net worth of housing as I don't know, as you compare it with the global GDP, for instance, it is 3 times the global GDP. The worth of housing globally is 3 times the global GDP. Housing equates more or less to 70% of all the global net worth. So it is a humongous sort of sector. But nonetheless, the political aspect of it, or the personal, the human aspect of it, is diluted, as Matt was saying before. So I think we have to come to raise the level of awareness of this. There needs to be some frankness in the political discussion about housing, in the sense that that's not, I'm not talking about making it political or partisan, but understanding that it is a political in the sense that it is a human, a social, economic, and cultural right that is at the basis of other rights. And if you don't get housing right, then other rights will become elusive, even more elusive. So I think to raise the visibility, we have to make housing, pass on the message that housing is the door to so many other things. It is the means to do a lot more things. Housing is not housing. Housing is so much more than housing.
I've been speaking with Matthew Dunbar, the Chief Strategy Officer and Executive Vice President for Habitat for Humanity of New York and Westchester County, and Dr. Maria Carrizosa, the Associate Director for Global Policy Housing for Habitat for Humanity International. And she is again the author of a new book, Homes at Work, Urban Informality and Recognition in Latin America and Africa. And I want to thank you both for joining me today. And thank you for tuning in and for listening. And join us again next week as we discuss another topic of international interest here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.